Undercover black CEO faces bias, calls emergency meeting. Vanessa Clark, the CEO of Summit Enterprises, had done everything to blend in. On a warm Miami morning, dressed in dark jeans, a pale blue sweater, and simple black loafers, she walked into Summit Wealth Bank. No entourage, no expensive designer bag, just a woman with a purpose. She wasn't the kind of person you'd expect to walk into a private client lounge in an elite financial institution. The bank's marble floors gleamed beneath the soft lighting, a space reserved for high-profile clients. But no one in the lounge knew who she was. Vanessa had purposely chosen to blend in, to see how the world would treat her when they didn't know her name or her wealth. She approached the front desk and requested access to the lounge, asking to make a $5 million withdrawal. The teller glanced at her and, without hesitation, directed her to the lounge, not once questioning her request. It wasn't until she sat down that the tension began to build. Lisa Newman, the branch manager, walked over with a sense of purpose. "We'll need proof of where your funds came from," Lisa said, her tone flat but sharp. Vanessa didn't flinch. She had been here before, dealt with this before. As Lisa looked at her tablet, scanning for any signs of irregularity, Vanessa didn't say a word. She calmly slid her own tablet across the desk, containing the documents that should have easily verified her request. But Lisa didn't even glance at it. "We need to confirm this," she said. That was when Edward Pierce, a white investment banker, casually walked past and tossed a remark that stung. "Don't clog up the line, sweetheart." The words weren't meant for Vanessa's ears, but they struck her nonetheless. They didn't know who she was. They didn't care. Edward didn't even stop to look back. A small group of others joined in, whispering under their breaths, casting glances at Vanessa. One of them, Natalie Wells, a private banker, eyed her with suspicion. "That amount doesn't add up," she muttered. "You could have stolen it." The words cut through the silence. But Vanessa didn't flinch. She had been here before, faced this kind of prejudice, this kind of treatment, since she was young. As a 23-year-old, when she had deposited her first real estate commission into her bank account, she had been treated like a criminal. At 26, she had been called high risk by a loan officer despite bringing in 30% more collateral than was required. And now, 2 decades later, the same thing was happening again. But this time, she was no longer just a woman trying to get by. She was Vanessa Clark, CEO of Summit Enterprises, with billions in assets, and she had had enough. "Run my name," she said calmly to Lisa. Lisa shook her head. "You're not verified," she replied. But Vanessa wasn't deterred. She had been prepared for this. As the tension rose, she met the eyes of everyone in the room. They could make their assumptions, but she knew the truth. She wasn't just any woman. And when they realized who she was, it would be too late. Vanessa sat there, calm but unwavering, as the whispers continued to swirl around her. The tension in the private client lounge was palpable. She could feel their eyes on her, the judgment, the suspicion. But it didn't matter. She had been in this position before, and this time, things were going to be different. Lisa Newman, the branch manager, was still standing by the desk, trying to assert control, but Vanessa remained unshaken. "You're not verified," Lisa repeated, trying to dismiss her with cold efficiency. Vanessa's response was slow, deliberate. "You'll regret this," she said quietly, her voice cutting through the tension. But Lisa wasn't listening. "Security," Lisa called out, her voice rising, but it wasn't a call for help. It was a demand to remove Vanessa from the room. At that moment, Vanessa felt a surge of determination. This was no longer about proving herself. This was about ensuring that no one would ever again have to face the humiliation and discrimination she had. As the words "security" echoed through the lounge, Vanessa calmly picked up her phone and dialed her executive assistant, Carla Evans. The phone rang only once before Carla picked up, her voice steady as always. "Ma'am." Vanessa paused for a moment, letting the weight of what she was about to do settle in. "Start Protocol 6, she said, her voice calm but firm. "They've crossed the line." Carla's response was immediate. "Understood, ma'am." Protocol 6 activated. Vanessa clicked off the phone and stood up slowly. It wasn't a dramatic movement, but it was enough to command attention. The room, which had been filled with quiet murmurs and disbelieving glances, fell into a strange silence. She looked directly at Lisa, her eyes unwavering. "You don't know who I am, do you?" Vanessa asked, her tone level but with a sharpness that sent a ripple through the room. Lisa hesitated, clearly thrown off by the question. I know your name, Lisa said, trying to maintain her composure, but there was uncertainty in her voice now. Vanessa didn't respond immediately. Instead, she reached for her tablet and slid it across the desk. Lisa looked down, her eyes widening as she saw the document before her. The realization hit her a moment too late. Vanessa Clark, the woman sitting before her, was the CEO of Summit Enterprises, the very company that owns Summit Wealth Bank. The lounge had grown still as everyone in the room realized what had just happened. The woman they had dismissed, the woman they had looked down upon, was the one who controlled it all. The shift in power was instantaneous. Lisa looked around, her face paling. But Vanessa wasn't done. You've just insulted the wrong person, Vanessa said, her voice low, but carrying the weight of her authority. This is my bank, my business. And what you've done today won't be forgotten. The silence that followed felt like a long, drawn-out moment, as if time had frozen. No one moved. No one spoke. Vanessa stood there, steady and unmoving, while the realization spread across the room. The truth had been laid bare. The CEO wasn't just a figurehead. They were the force that controlled everything. Vanessa reached into her bag, pulling out her phone again. She dialed Carla's number once more. "Get me the compliance team," she said, her voice steady. "They need to know what just happened here. This branch needs to be audited immediately." Carla's voice came through, quick and professional. "On it, ma'am. Compliance is already aware. We're handling it." Vanessa hung up the phone and turned back to the room. "I'm not leaving until this is resolved," she said, her eyes scanning the room, locking eyes with every person who had doubted her. "I'll be right here, watching as this all plays out." The staff, now realizing the gravity of the situation, shifted uneasily. No one had expected this. No one had imagined that the woman they had treated with such disdain was the one who held the keys to it all. The tension in the private client lounge was suffocating as Vanessa stood silently, her eyes locked on Lisa, who was visibly struggling to regain control of the situation. The realization of what had just transpired was dawning on everyone around her. They had underestimated her, treated her like she was just another person, another face in the crowd. But now, the power dynamic had shifted entirely. The quiet confidence that Vanessa exuded was palpable, and the weight of her authority settled heavily in the room. Lisa, still trying to maintain some semblance of control, turned to the staff. "Get the compliance team here now," she said, her voice shaky. But it was too late. Vanessa had already set things in motion. "The compliance team is already on their way, Lisa," Vanessa said, her voice calm and steady. She wasn't shouting, she wasn't angry, she was in full control. Every word she spoke held weight. "You don't get to treat me like this," Vanessa continued. "You don't get to question my legitimacy in a place I own. And you certainly don't get to make me feel like I don't belong here." Lisa looked at her with a mix of disbelief and frustration. "You can't just barge in here and demand things," she said, trying to regain some control, but the fire in her voice was gone. Vanessa didn't respond to her. Instead, she turned to the other employees in the room, the ones who had silently watched as the manager tried to force her out. "I'm not angry," Vanessa said, her eyes scanning the room. "But what I am is disappointed. Disappointed in the way you've allowed this behavior to happen. Disappointed that you've chosen to turn a blind eye to what's been happening here." The silence in the room grew heavier as Vanessa's words echoed in the ears of the people who had witnessed everything. A few of the clients sitting in the lounge exchanged glances, nodding in agreement, their faces reflecting a mix of empathy and guilt. Vanessa took a slow breath, feeling the weight of the moment. She knew that this was more than just a confrontation, it was a reckoning. A reckoning for the system that had allowed discrimination to fester unchecked for so long. And it was time for it to end. "I've been treated like a criminal my whole life, for no reason other than the color of my skin," Vanessa said, her voice unwavering. "But not anymore. Not in my company. Not in this bank." She paused, letting the gravity of her words sink in. The room seemed to shift as her authority became undeniable. Lisa, who had been ready to argue, was now speechless. The other employees stood frozen, their guilt and unease apparent on their faces. At that moment, Vanessa knew what she had to do. "I've activated Protocol 6, Vanessa continued, turning her gaze back to Lisa. You're about to learn what happens when you abuse your position. You're going to learn what it means to be held accountable for your actions. Lisa's face drained of color. The other employees were visibly sweating now, the consequences of their actions setting in. I want everyone in this room to understand something, Vanessa said, her voice carrying the weight of authority. This is what happens when you treat people with disrespect. This is what happens when you forget that everyone deserves fairness. I'm not just the CEO of Summit Enterprises. I'm the one who ensures that fairness is upheld. As she spoke, the staff seemed to shrink in their seats, their power dwindling in the face of the undeniable truth. Vanessa turned toward the door as the compliance team entered, led by Carla Evans, her loyal executive assistant. It's time for the audit, Vanessa said, her voice cutting through the silence. Time to clean up the mess that's been allowed to grow here. The compliance team moved swiftly, taking control of the situation, their presence marking the beginning of a long overdue reckoning for the bank. As Vanessa walked out of the lounge, the weight of the moment still hung heavy in the air. She knew this was only the beginning. But today, justice had been served, and it felt like a victory. The moment Carla Evans and the compliance team entered the lounge, the atmosphere shifted from tense silence to a quiet storm of action. The staff who had once towered over Vanessa now looked small, their faces pale as they realized the gravity of what had just occurred. Carla, sharp and composed, stepped forward to take control. She exchanged a brief glance with Vanessa, who gave her a single nod of approval. The compliance team moved with purpose, pulling out documents, taking notes, and preparing to launch an immediate audit of the entire branch. Vanessa stood back, watching as the wheels of justice turned with precision. She had set the course, but now it was up to the team to ensure that the wrongdoers were held accountable. As Carla called the team to action, Vanessa turned her attention to the others in the room. The clients, who had been silent witnesses to this unfolding drama, now looked at her with a mix of admiration and understanding. Vanessa knew that the impact of this moment would stretch far beyond the confines of the bank. It wasn't just about this branch. It was about creating a precedent, a standard that would not tolerate discrimination, that would not allow biases to fester in any corner of her company. The staff, now under the scrutiny of the compliance team, were visibly shaken. Lisa, who had once been so confident in her position, now stood with her head down, unable to meet Vanessa's gaze. The others, including Natalie and Edward, shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their once dominant postures now deflated. Vanessa felt a deep sense of resolve. She had made her point, but this was only the beginning. The road ahead would be long, but it was necessary. The bank needed to be rebuilt, not just in terms of its policies, but in its culture. As she looked around the room, she caught sight of a young employee standing near the back, watching everything unfold with wide eyes. It was clear that she was new, likely nervous about what was happening. Vanessa's gaze softened. This young woman, like so many others, would need guidance. It was time to change the way things worked, not just for her, but for every employee who had been ignored, marginalized, or forced to turn a blind eye to injustice. Vanessa took a deep breath, steadying herself for what was to come. She knew this wouldn't be easy, and there would be resistance. But as the compliance team began their audit and the staff remained under scrutiny, Vanessa realized that the real work was just beginning. She turned to Carla, who had just finished a quick phone call. "We need to start the training sessions tomorrow," Carla said, her voice as determined as ever. "This won't be a one-time fix. We need to embed this into every corner of Summit Wealth Bank." Vanessa nodded in agreement. "It's not enough to react," she said. "We need to reshape the entire foundation. This is the first step." As the meeting continued, Vanessa felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. Today, she had set a course for justice. But tomorrow, she would rebuild, one policy, one employee, and one interaction at a time. It was a long road ahead, but Vanessa was ready to walk it, and she wasn't going to do it alone. The following morning, the compliance team worked tirelessly, digging through years of data, meticulously combing through every file and every report. Vanessa stood nearby, watching the process unfold with a sense of quiet satisfaction. She knew that this audit, though necessary, was just the beginning of a much larger overhaul. As the team worked, she gathered her thoughts, reflecting on the previous day's events. The truth had been laid bare. The employees who had once held power in the bank were now under scrutiny, and there was no going back. Lisa and the others had been given a chance to make things right, but they had failed. Now, it was time for real change. Vanessa turned to Carla, who was overseeing the audit and coordinating with the team. "We need to address the culture shift immediately," Vanessa said, her voice calm but determined. "We can't just fix the system on paper. It has to be real." Carla nodded, understanding exactly what Vanessa meant. "The new training sessions will start tomorrow," she replied. "We'll make sure everyone, from the top down, understands the new expectations." Vanessa felt a surge of pride. She had come so far, but there was still so much work to be done. She knew that change wouldn't happen overnight. There would be resistance. There would be pushback from those who preferred the old ways. But Vanessa was ready for that. She had faced far worse in her life, and she knew that the path to success was never easy. She looked out of the large windows of her office, watching as the city of Miami came to life. There was a new energy in the air, a sense of anticipation. For the first time in a long time, Vanessa felt like she was on the right path. As the day wore on, Vanessa met with her leadership team. She explained her vision for Summit Wealth Bank, a bank that would not just be financially successful, but would also be a beacon of fairness and equality. "We're going to change the way this bank operates," she told them, her voice firm. "It starts with the way we treat people. No one will be discriminated against here, not based on their race, their gender, or their appearance. We're going to set a new standard." The room fell silent as her words sank in. Some nodded in agreement, while others seemed unsure of what this new direction would mean for them. But Vanessa knew that the changes would be necessary, even if uncomfortable. "This isn't just about policies," she continued. "It's about creating an environment where every person, no matter their background, feels like they belong." The meeting ended with a sense of quiet resolve. Vanessa knew there was still a long road ahead. The work that lay ahead wasn't just about making changes to the company's structure. It was about changing minds, changing attitudes, and breaking down long-held biases. But Vanessa was undeterred. She had always believed in the power of perseverance. As the day came to a close, Vanessa sat in her office, looking over the files from the audit. The compliance team had found several disturbing patterns, but nothing that Vanessa hadn't already suspected. The real work was ahead. It wasn't enough to just uncover the wrongs. They had to be corrected, and Vanessa was more than ready to lead that charge. She leaned back in her chair, taking a deep breath. The path forward was clear. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she had already proven that she was ready to face whatever challenges came her way. As the days passed, the atmosphere at Summit Wealth Bank began to shift. Employees who had once turned a blind eye to the subtle biases around them now found themselves confronting uncomfortable truths. The compliance audit had revealed much, but Vanessa knew that the true transformation wouldn't come from policies alone. It would come from within each person in the bank, from a change in mindset that had to be embraced at every level of the organization. She had made her point with the firing of the staff members who had been complicit in the discriminatory practices, but the work wasn't over. There was still a lot to be done. Vanessa made it clear to her leadership team that the training would begin immediately. "This isn't just a check-the-box exercise," she told them one morning, sitting at the head of the conference table. "This is about reshaping the very foundation of this organization." The room was quiet as her words sank in. Some of her leaders were already on board, while others looked uncertain. It was understandable. Change of this magnitude was always met with resistance. But Vanessa was ready to face it. Over the next few weeks, the bank's culture began to evolve. Training sessions, led by external diversity and inclusion experts, were scheduled, and every employee, no matter their position, was required to attend. There were sessions on unconscious bias, on how to create a truly inclusive environment, and on the importance of standing up against discrimination in all its forms. Vanessa made sure to attend the sessions herself, sitting quietly in the back of the room, observing. She wanted to understand how the employees were reacting, how they were absorbing the lessons. The feedback was mixed. Some employees seemed eager to learn, taking the lessons to heart and genuinely working to improve their understanding. Others, however, struggled. It was clear that the bank's culture had deep roots, and uprooting it would take time. But Vanessa wasn't discouraged. She knew that every small step forward was a victory. Meanwhile, the legal and compliance teams were working overtime, revising policies, ensuring that the systems were in place to prevent any future instances of discrimination. Vanessa made it clear that accountability would be paramount. There would be no more tolerating bad behavior, no more turning a blind eye. We can't just make changes to the system. We have to make them personal, she said during a meeting with her senior leadership team. If we want real change, we have to be committed to it every day. Her words resonated with her team, and soon, she saw a shift in how people interacted with one another in the office. There was more openness, more willingness to listen, and more efforts to ensure that everyone's voice was heard. The real breakthrough came one afternoon when a junior employee, Maya, approached Vanessa with a concern. Maya had been working at the bank for a few months and had witnessed subtle instances of bias that others hadn't noticed. She was hesitant to speak up, but had been inspired by the changes she had seen since the new training began. I don't know if this is the right time or if I should even bring this up, Maya said, her voice shaky. But I've noticed that some of our clients are being treated differently based on their race or their appearance. I don't know if anyone else has noticed, but I think it's something we should address. Vanessa listened carefully, her face calm but attentive. Thank you for bringing this to my attention, Vanessa said after a long pause. It's important that you feel comfortable speaking up. This is exactly the kind of change we're trying to create here. Maya looked relieved, and Vanessa knew that this moment was a sign that the culture shift was beginning to take hold. People were starting to feel empowered to speak out against injustice, even when it was difficult. As the months passed, Vanessa continued to lead Summit Wealth Bank through its transformation. The road was not without its bumps, and there were moments of frustration. But every time someone spoke up, every time the bank took another step toward inclusivity, Vanessa knew that they were moving closer to the vision she had for the company. A vision where everyone, no matter their background, was treated with the respect and dignity they deserved. Months had passed since the training began, and the change at Summit Wealth Bank was becoming palpable. The once tense atmosphere in the office had shifted to one of collaboration and mutual respect. Vanessa Clark knew that the work was far from over, but she also knew that they were on the right path. It was in the small moments, the ones that went unnoticed, where she saw the real transformation happening. The way employees interacted with one another, the way they listened, the way they called out discriminatory behavior when they saw it. These were the signs that the culture was evolving. But one afternoon, something happened that reminded Vanessa just how deep the biases ran. A client, a prominent businessman, had come into the bank for a high-stakes meeting. Vanessa wasn't scheduled to attend, but she heard from the assistant that the client was acting difficult, asking for a specific account manager, someone who had a reputation for being a bit more flexible with the rules. Vanessa had worked hard to build a culture of integrity, and it was times like this that tested her resolve. She decided to step into the meeting herself. She walked into the room, where the client was sitting, his demeanor dismissive and impatient. "Mr. Richardson," she greeted him calmly. "I'm Vanessa Clark, CEO of Summit Enterprises. I understand you have some concerns." The man looked up, his expression hardening as he realized who she was. "I'm not sure why you're here," he said, clearly annoyed. "I just need to get this sorted out with someone who knows how to handle things." Vanessa didn't let his tone affect her. "I'm here because I want to make sure that everything is handled properly," she said, sitting down across from him. "What exactly seems to be the problem?" The conversation continued, but it didn't take long for the underlying issue to surface. Mr. Richardson, it turned out, wasn't happy with the service he had received from a staff member because, in his words, she didn't look the part. Vanessa's blood ran cold. She had heard these kinds of comments before, but hearing them directed at one of her employees was different. The employee in question, Maya, was a young woman who had been with the company for only a few months. But in those months, she had proven herself to be an asset. She was smart, dedicated, and capable. But Mr. Richardson's issue with her was that she wasn't what he expected. She wasn't the kind of person he thought should be in a position of power. Vanessa's mind raced as she considered how to handle this. She could feel the weight of the situation. It was more than just a client complaint. It was a reflection of the biases that had been allowed to fester for so long. "Mr. Richardson," Vanessa began, her voice calm but firm. "Let me make something clear. The person you are referring to is a valued employee of this company. She has earned her position, and she has earned the respect of everyone here. If you cannot respect her for who she is and the work she does, then I believe this partnership is not a good fit." The room fell silent. For a moment, Mr. Richardson seemed taken aback, unsure of how to respond. But then his demeanor shifted. The arrogance he had carried into the room began to crack. He cleared his throat and straightened up in his seat. "I didn't mean to," he started, but Vanessa cut him off. "You don't get to make those kinds of assumptions about anyone who works here. Not under my watch," she said. "And if you choose to disrespect them, you are disrespecting me, and that's not something I'm willing to tolerate." The tension in the room was thick, but there was no turning back now. Mr. Richardson finally nodded, but it wasn't a sign of agreement. It was the reluctant acknowledgement that Vanessa wasn't going to let him get away with his prejudices. As he left the room, Vanessa couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. She had stood her ground, not just for herself, but for her team, for the people who worked tirelessly every day to create an environment of fairness and respect. But as she sat back in her office, a sense of unease lingered. She knew that this was just one battle in a long war. The biases that had been allowed to thrive for so long couldn't be eradicated overnight. But she was committed to seeing it through, no matter how many people resisted or tried to undermine her. Summit Wealth Bank had a long road ahead, but with each step they took, they were creating a space where people like Maya no longer had to prove themselves. It wasn't just about policies or audits. It was about real, lasting change. And Vanessa was ready to fight for it every single day. As the weeks went by, Summit Wealth Bank continued its transformation under Vanessa's leadership. The ripple effects of her stand against the bias that had once been deeply ingrained in the company were beginning to spread. It wasn't just the policies or the mandatory training sessions that made the difference. It was the shift in the attitudes of the employees. They were no longer turning a blind eye to discrimination or allowing biases to influence their behavior. Slowly, the company was evolving into the inclusive, fair place Vanessa had always envisioned. However, progress wasn't without its challenges. There were still those who clung to the old ways, those who resisted change because it threatened their power or comfort. Vanessa knew that it wasn't enough to make big gestures and expect things to magically fall into place. The real work was happening in the everyday interactions between employees, between clients, and between the company and the community. She had made it clear that anyone who treated others unfairly would be held accountable. But the true test of the culture shift would be when they faced adversity. One day, as Vanessa sat in her office, her assistant Carla brought in a report about a new complaint that had surfaced. A client, an influential business owner, had filed a grievance against one of the bank's senior employees, claiming that they had been unfairly treated during a meeting. The client's complaint wasn't about the quality of the service, but about the way he had been spoken to by the employee, a woman who had recently been promoted. The complaint hinted at bias, a suspicion that the client had felt dismissed because of his gender. Vanessa read through the report carefully. Her first instinct was to investigate, to make sure the employee wasn't being unfairly accused. But she also knew that this was an opportunity to reinforce the culture shift. She immediately called Carla. "Get me that employee in my office," she said, her voice steady. "And have the client come in as well. I want to hear both sides." The room felt heavy when the client walked in. He was a powerful man, confident in his position, but there was a nervous energy about him. He took a seat in front of Vanessa's desk, his eyes scanning the room before finally resting on her. Vanessa wasn't intimidated by him, though. She had learned long ago that true power didn't come from a title or a position. It came from the ability to stand firm in your values. "I understand you have a concern about one of our senior employees," Vanessa said calmly. The client hesitated before speaking, his words laced with frustration. "I felt dismissed," he said, his voice rising slightly, "as if my opinions didn't matter. I don't care about the service, but I won't stand for that kind of treatment." Vanessa nodded. "I understand," she said, her tone even. "Now let's talk to the employee." When the employee walked in, Vanessa could see the nervousness in her eyes. She was young, eager to prove herself, and had worked hard to get to where she was. "Tell me what happened," Vanessa asked her directly. The employee took a deep breath and explained the situation. She admitted that she had been firm with the client, but only because she felt that his behavior was condescending. "He kept interrupting me," she said, her voice tinged with uncertainty. "I felt like he wasn't listening, and I had to assert myself." Vanessa listened carefully, not rushing to judgment. She understood that both sides often saw things from different perspectives. After a long pause, Vanessa looked at both the client and the employee. It seems like there's been a breakdown in communication, she said finally. But I want you both to understand something. Here at Summit Wealth Bank, we don't tolerate anyone feeling dismissed or disrespected, no matter who they are. That's not the culture we're building. But we also don't tolerate aggression or condescension. We are all here to support one another and work together. The client and the employee exchanged uncertain glances, but the tension in the room began to dissolve. Vanessa's calm authority had shifted the conversation from a power struggle to a collaborative problem-solving discussion. I think the issue here is a lack of understanding, Vanessa continued. The next step is to find common ground. I expect both of you to come together and figure out how to move forward respectfully. With that, the client and the employee shook hands, both of them seeming more at ease. As they left, Vanessa turned to Carla. This is the kind of change we need, she said. It's not just about having the right policies. It's about creating a culture where people can communicate, understand each other, and resolve conflict without fear of retaliation. Carla nodded, her face thoughtful. It's working, she said. People are starting to feel like they're truly valued. Vanessa smiled, but it wasn't a smile of triumph. It was a quiet, knowing smile. The work was far from over, but every step forward felt like a victory. Summit Wealth Bank was becoming something new, something better. And Vanessa was proud of the progress they had made. As Vanessa walked through the newly renovated Summit Wealth Bank headquarters, she couldn't help but reflect on the journey she had taken. It had been months since the incident in the private client lounge, and the changes in the bank were undeniable. The atmosphere was different now, brighter, more open, and more inclusive. Employees no longer hesitated to speak up when they saw something wrong. They knew that they had a leader who would support them, a leader who would not stand for injustice. The transformation wasn't perfect, and Vanessa knew it. There were still moments when old habits crept in, when biases surfaced, but they were being confronted, addressed, and, most importantly, changed. The work was far from done, but the foundation had been set. As Vanessa passed by the open offices, she smiled as she saw Maya at her desk, working diligently. Maya had been with Summit Wealth Bank for a little over a year now, and she had become a model employee, not just because of her work ethic, but because of her commitment to the bank's new values. It hadn't been an easy transition for her, but Maya had embraced it with an open mind and heart. Vanessa stopped for a moment, leaning against the doorframe, watching Maya at her computer. She knew Maya had been one of the first employees to feel the ripple effects of the changes that had taken place at the bank. She had been one of the first to speak up when she noticed the subtle discrimination that had permeated the workplace. And now, she was thriving in her role, respected by her colleagues, and leading by example. It was a reminder of how far they had come. In the months since the implementation of the new policies and culture shifts, there had been noticeable improvements in both employee satisfaction and client relations. The complaints had decreased, but the real change was in the culture, a culture where everyone felt seen, heard, and valued, no matter their background. Vanessa's phone buzzed in her pocket, snapping her back to the present. It was a message from Carla. The final report on the audit is in. We've completed the necessary steps, but we'll need to continue monitoring the progress. Vanessa replied with a simple message, great. Let's keep pushing. As the day wound down, Vanessa made her way to the conference room, where a meeting was scheduled with her leadership team. She had been having these meetings regularly now, not just to review financial goals and strategies, but to ensure that the culture remained at the forefront of their work. Summit Wealth Bank had grown, but it had done so on the back of its values that Vanessa would not let go of. She entered the room and greeted the team, her presence commanding, yet welcoming. I'm proud of how far we've come, she began, her voice steady and full of conviction. But let's be clear, we are only just getting started. This journey doesn't end here. There was a quiet agreement in the room as everyone nodded, understanding the weight of her words. The changes they had implemented were not just about policies or training sessions. They were about creating an environment where people from all walks of life could succeed, where they could thrive without fear of discrimination or bias. We've set a new standard for this industry, Vanessa continued, and we're going to continue setting the example. Our work is far from over, and we can't afford to let our guard down. The team listened intently, and Vanessa could see that they were just as committed as she was to making Summit Wealth Bank a leader in inclusivity and fairness. As the meeting came to a close, Vanessa stood up, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders once again. But this time, it didn't feel heavy. It felt right. She had set out to change a company, but in the process, she had changed herself too. She had faced her own biases, confronted the systems that had held people back, and fought for a better future, for her team, for the bank, and for the community it served. Vanessa walked out of the meeting, her head held high, knowing that the road ahead would still be challenging, but also knowing that with each step, she was making a difference. Summit Wealth Bank was no longer just a place to work. It was a place where people could belong, and that was the legacy she was creating.